It was, well, I was in law school, so I'm a University of Michigan grad, class of 91 from the law school, that in constitutional law, where you tend to have discussions about some of the weightiest of topics, what's the just way to order a society, what are the implications of broad constitutional principles. And so I remember the professor asked our class the following question. He said, how many of you believe that there are actions that are always right or always wrong? Now, about 60% of the class, 50 to 60%, raised their hands and agreed with that proposition. Perhaps we were unjaded by the nuances of the law at that time. He was taken aback. He actually thought it would be much less. That in an age of what we refer to as relativism, where somebody says, well, it might be right for you or wrong for you, but it might be okay with me or wrong for me, that it's really a matter of subjective opinion as to the advisability of a particular action. He was surprised that at its core, almost 60% of us assented to the fact that there's a right and a wrong. Now, if we flash forward to the readings that we have today, and the saint who we honor today, she is a saint who has what is known as a childlike simplicity, Saint Therese of Lisieux. And this simplicity carried with it a great sophistication. She's considered a doctor of the church in her theological writings. But what we hear today is the following: unless you turn, this is in the Gospel of Matthew, and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And I think that if you were to ask children or observe their behavior, you would see an appreciation for the sense of right and wrong. In fact, the littlest ones, one of the expressions, if they see something, they'll say, that's not fair. How come he gets this, but I don't? That's not fair. How come she gets to stay out later, but I don't? That's not fair. How come they get to go out and play, but I can't? There's like this intuitive sense of fairness, of something that seems to be right and something that seems to be wrong. Now, as we understand this, we can appreciate that in the midst of sophisticated legal arguments and the demands of the day, the work that judges and lawyers and those who support the legal community and the administration of justice can have various levels of complexity, but it also should evoke some core key principles. And sometimes as we reflect on this simple intuition that there's a right and a wrong, we can think about the law's relationship to that in a couple different ways. So one would be that because of divine revelation, the commandments given to Moses, the law that's been passed on, rooted in this divine will, that we come to appreciate the law more fully as rooted in something beyond ourselves. But this can also turn the other way. Namely, that if we do believe, whether a believer in the theological sense or not, that there is a right and wrong that doesn't exist because it's my opinion or my feeling or my perspective, but if we truly believe that there is a right and a wrong, then that points us to an absolute that's beyond ourselves. An absolute that can't exactly be articulated based on looking in a petri dish or developing the perfect theorem. Rather, it's this intuition that there is something absolute in the moral order that does not depend upon my opinion regarding that. It is true. Now, we hear in the Psalms, and we hear throughout Scripture, "Guide me, Lord, in the way of your commands." Guide me, Lord, in the way of your command. So it's a plea that God will guide us according to his will, according to his law. To make such a statement presumes there is a God and that we're to act in accord with that word. Now, the challenge for many is that the very notion of the existence of a God is increasingly, I'd say, under attack, or just objectively, there are far greater numbers who are what we would call the nones. I don't mean like religious nuns, N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S. When you take a survey, they ask you, do you have any religious affiliation? And they'll say, none. That's how they answer that. They have no religious affiliation. And so we live in a culture in which absolutes that don't exist in the scientific world are increasingly subject to criticism, attack, disbelief. Now, Archbishop Alan Vigneron, in a pastoral letter, Unleash the Gospel, gave a passage on one of the challenges of the day. It goes under sociologists refer to this as scientific fundamentalism. Scientific fundamentalism. Here's how it's defined. Scientific fundamentalism is a belief that all questions about human existence in the world can be answered by experimental science. The universe is regarded as a closed system in which everything can be explained by the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and evolution. God, if he exists at all, does not intervene in the world. Anything that cannot be proven scientifically is assumed to be false, or at least unimportant. Now, in reality, such a belief attributes to science a role that is far beyond its competence, since there are vast domains of existence that experimental science cannot account for, including ethical goods, aesthetic values, love, friendship, sacrifice, knowledge, and even science itself. So, as a culture, we've been seduced in so many ways that all of our answers can be found in one discipline. And yet that one discipline cannot answer of itself the biggest of questions about the meaning of life, the joys of life, the moral order, beauty, goodness, truth. It's beyond that scientific realm, and yet we impute to science almost a fundamentalism beyond its legitimate scope. Church is not anti-science. Occam's razor, which was one of the first scientific methodologies, said you choose the simplest of two explanations when given competing narratives, and that became the scientific method that has continued through to today. So this is not an anti-scientific reference, but it is an acknowledgement that we have so much more beyond this that we need to be able to infuse with meaning. So, let me tell you how this played out. I mentioned this question that the law professor gave us, and that question led to, as you know, when you're in law school, like, you have these huge, enormous, questions about the meaning of life. So I had a good friend of mine who was an atheist. It was interesting because he self-identified as an atheist for life. He was pro-life in his views, in the sense that he believed that it was simply wrong to take an innocent human life in utero. He was an atheist, he was a law student, and this was his belief. And so we had this series of questions about, are there things that really are just right or wrong? So, there's some horrific examples. Like, you could never, ever justify and say, well, Hitler thought the Holocaust was right. That's absolutely rejected. The harming of an infant. How could that ever be right? How could you say, well, to this person that was right? We'd reject that argument out of hand. While he was not a believer, the further we went in this conversation, he began to acknowledge, if there is something that's absolute, that I can't prove by a truly scientific methodology, but I know it's there. That was the starting point for an insight into God. And so His starting point was not there is a God and now let me understand the laws that flows from him. It was this intuition that there is a right and wrong that is reflected in the legal order and the moral order. And my acknowledgement of that means that there has to be something beyond me that's absolute. And that he found as a pathway to say that he was going to be an agnostic, not an atheist anymore. Because it just opened that window enough to him to say, there's something beyond me. There's something that I must be rooted in that doesn't just exist on my opinion. And so for him, that innocent answer of a child, you might say, says that's not fair, or, that knows there's a right and a wrong in a certain intuitive sense, opened up the possibility that there was a God because of this sense of the absolute that exists beyond ourselves. In law school and legal ethics, one of the assignments that we had was to watch the famous movie, It's a Man for All Seasons. It's the accounting of St. Thomas More and his fidelity, rooted in the law, to the very end, which ultimately led to his martyrdom. And he's a saint, as we know, one of the patrons of the legal profession. Now, in having us watch this, our professor, at a public law school said, well, I don't want you to watch this and think of God. That's what he held out for, but just whatever's most important to you. Like, you got to have something that's most important to you. Whatever that is, watch this movie and just think about whatever's most important to you, which really kind of stripped the movie of much of his meaning. But it was a different way to almost suggest, we know that there's something absolute, and so watch this with this sense that there's something beyond you that binds you. Now, for those of us in the legal profession or who have been in the legal profession, this intuition that we are serving in some way part of this greater good can give us a deeper level of meaning in the work that we do. Because so much of what we do in the law, be it in the criminal law area, be it in the civil law area, be it in the judicial area, or in other elements that might be more transactional, we have this opportunity to see our work linked to this wider plateau, this heavenly plateau, on which we're seeking ultimately to do what's right and to advance that common good. So many areas of criminal law touch really upon the classic understanding of moral theology. And so, for example, Leo Katz's book, Bad Acts and Guilty Minds, is a long examination into, well, if you think you are committing an act and you're, not certain as to what you're doing, what's your level of culpability? Very similar analysis as to what one might do in the confessional as you look at the act and the intention and you see how those intersect as you help somebody who is in need of spiritual advice. Transactional law, to see this grand plateau on which we exist and in which we have our meaning and purpose, the more that we uphold the legitimate contractual rights that parties may enter into, it provides a stability, and typically those countries that are very economically interdependent are less prone to be able to engage in military conflicts against each other because the ties that bind them become even more and more intense. In fact, living with this sense that there is something beyond ourselves, rather than leading us away from a proper understanding, can infuse our work with a deeper level of meaning and understanding. There are different legal schools that are out there, different methodologies and approaches. Traditionally, University of Chicago was an economic school. Harvard would bounce back and forth between critical legal theory. There's some legal positivists that are out there. It was interesting, as I was a member of the Christian law students, we had one of our professors come and meet with us, and he had a degree in philosophy as well as in the law. When we met with him, he said his way to understand, at least the educational theory at that time, as was promoted there, he would call it structures of authority. But he told us it was actually a theological methodology. that he actually understood that the reception of a received text and its understanding over time, the reception of principles that pass down through generations, applying them to the current scenario, is very much like a theological methodology. But he said he would never say that publicly because people would think he was imposing theology on the law. But he actually saw the methodology as a theological one. You know, when we think about the little flower, St. Therese, she had this innocence about her that allowed that childlike demeanor to give her a deeper appreciation for her life and the life of those around her. While not infants when we entered law school, it is helpful to roll the clock back and kind of savor that first love. To say, here's why I got into this in the first place. To say, I want to have meaning in my work, and I want to help advance a common good, a properly ordered society, and find fulfillment in doing that. Over the years, we can lay on so many layers and layers and layers that we kind of lose what one might say is that childlike simplicity that we might have had in even pursuing a legal career, which is not just a career, and it's not just a profession, but for many of us, it's a vocation. It's this sense that I had, not just like I wanted to be a lawyer, but like I felt I should be a lawyer, which is a little different than saying like it's just what I desire. There's this sense that we are part of something greater. Thank you for saying yes to that call. And if you haven't seen it as a call, prayerfully reflect upon how you can see it as fulfilling this deeper mission. The most simplest of intuitions. That's fair. That's not fair. That's right. That's wrong. It can be a window into a reality far beyond us. It can be a window into God himself. May our imitation of the little flower lead us to a deeper appreciation of our role in advancing the common good, giving a deeper insight into the mind of God and allowing our society to flourish.